Hello and welcome to True Crime Convos. I am your host, Lanie Hobbs. I'm the host of the True Crime Cases with Lanie podcast, the paranormal podcast called It's Haunted, What Now, and the brand new podcast from Acast and Podster called Tracing Darkness. Now, I'm about to welcome some very amazing and awesome people to the stage. I am excited to welcome them to the show for the first time. They're also very new indie podcasters, which, I have a strong affinity for. So welcome Shaun and John to the podcast. They host the
Hey.
Survivors podcast. So welcome to the show, y'all. I'm happy to have you here despite the crazy things that are going on right now. Can you give us, before we get started, actually, we want to say something. And since you guys are local to the area, I think for sure you should go first about what's kind of unfolded in Las Vegas.
You want me to answer that one?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, today, around noon local time, there was a shooting on the campus of UNLV. As of now, the police are still investigating, and they haven't really given a lot of details that we're aware of, except that 3 individuals are dead, 1 individual is in critical condition, and the alleged shooter was engaged with police and was killed, so the shooter is dead. At this point, there's no more threat to the campus, but John and I, because we live here in Vegas, we have friends who are professors, friends who are doing some, master's education at UNLV who were all at the campus today. I would say we knew about 8 different people who were there.
Mhm.
So it was a very scary time for everyone, and our heart just breaks for our community because October 1, it was more than 5 years ago now, but it's still really raw for a lot of people here. So just like always, I would say, if you're experiencing any ill mental health effects after this, you can always call 988. You can always call 988 and talk to someone about what you're feeling, because it is traumatic for our community. So please reach out to folks if you need that support.
Thanks. And then we also had a spree shooting here that happened overnight in San Antonio and Austin. We had, I think, about 5 people affected and lost. We don't have a ton of information that's out there yet. We do know who the perpetrator is. I don't ever give any names when it comes to that. So once we learn the individuals who were affected, then that's typically when I will share some information. But I don't think the person should ever get any type of, glory in that sense. I would love to hear more about your show and what helped you kind of get started, what prompted you to create a podcast. You have been listeners for a while, so I always get so excited when I see listeners take the plunge and turn into creators. And I think it gives you hopefully a new appreciation of what podcasters do and the work that they do behind the scenes to create, compelling content. So give us some interesting tidbits on that.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it especially we find it impressive when people have more than one podcast, because I feel like some days we are drowning under the weight of a single podcast.
Yes.
So many kudos if you can handle more than one, or 4 in some cases. That's crazy. But really the idea for our podcast, you're kind of partially responsible for, actually.
Ah,
So we went to the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival in Austin this year.
yes.
I think, Shaun, did you go before, or was
No,
this?
no, that was my first
I was
year.
gonna say,
Okay,
this is
you've
the
been to
first
other
time we've
ones.
Yeah.
Okay. So of course that's your festival, Lanie. It was great, and we absolutely recommend that everybody go buy tickets right now. Somebody throw up a
Yay.
link somewhere. We'll have to share that. And while we were there, as we were listening to all the speakers, it occurred to both of us that all of them, or not all of them, a lot of them had a domestic violence angle in many of the cases.
Mhm.
And the cases that we knew about for a long time, and cases we were just hearing about. And Shaun will tell you about her work, so I don't want to spoil her story there, and her background. But my immediate thought was that we always talk about the DV angle in these cases, and we're like,
Mhm.
oh, that is another. Let's talk about the DV there.
Yeah.
And so many of those cases happen here in Las Vegas, shockingly. So it made sense to us to, look into creating a podcast that addressed those two things, since nothing like that seemed to exist yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was surprised that there wasn't really a Vegas centric podcast for locations. I was
True.
surprised for true crime
Yeah.
podcasts.
I mean, there's
Yeah.
literally been podcasts created everywhere for like
Yeah.
every destination, but I'm
But
same
not here.
surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially if you watch our local news at night, like John said, well, there'll be a case. It feels like there's a case every night that to us. It's probably not accurate, but it does feel like probably once a week there's something that we go,
It's another one.
like, yeah.
Yeah.
Put in the list.
John said I would talk about my work a little bit. I studied criminal justice in college, and I'm just always curious about what causes crime, how we can build stronger communities and prevent crime. So I went to law school, but I really wanted to work in prevention. So my whole career, I've worked with agencies that either directly provided services to victims, especially victims of domestic violence or child abuse, or agencies that address the factors related to that, like mental health, substance abuse treatment, things like that. But I did go to CrimeCon Vegas in 2022. That might have been what you were thinking about when you said I went before.
Yes, that is.
And that was Gabby Petito's year where she was all over the news. Her story was all over the news. And I had some issues with the way that was covered and that was handled. And especially when I went to CrimeCon, it kind of sort of put the idea in my head that, the true crime community could do better. And when we went to your festival, it just kind of all clicked. Like John said, there's so much more we can be doing to address the issues of domestic violence as a part of the ethical true crime work we always want to be putting out there.
Absolutely. No. And I love hearing kind of that feedback, because that's what I want people to take away from attending the festival. You know, it's really geared towards supporting families and making sure they have a voice, when so often, especially within what we do, we are, you know, being their voice in some way, and some are doing it, in a great way, and others are using it for their own gain without really care or consideration.
Yeah.
And so I'm really thankful that that's what you took from it, because if it ends tomorrow, or we decide for some reason to never do another one, that I've heard this recently. It's been amazing and an honor for me to hear that. So it's kind of one of the things I'm most proud of doing ever. Forget, the podcast and everything. It's been incredible. So I appreciate you saying that, and also talking positively about
course.
the True Crime Podcast Festival,
Of
or
course.
Paranormal Podcast Festival. See, even I say it short. Anyhow, so I'm so thankful you guys are here. It was such an honor and so much fun to meet you in person. And then we've communicated a ton over Instagram. And so I'm glad that, we've connected on the following cases that we're going to talk about today. And I've been planning it. What you don't know while you're watching is that I am what I say is a Dumbledore. And we were supposed to do this like a week ago. And I was just like, God, Shaun is on it. She's just like keeping me on track and is like 2 weeks ahead of time and going for it. And then was like, hey, are you getting on this thing? And I was like, no, no, I'm not. But I'm really glad we could reschedule and kind of timely, because I just covered these cases maybe a couple of weeks ago. And to me, the first two cases have some really interesting similarities. And then Shaun, you recommended the last case, the Lululemon murders that were perpetrated by Brittany Norwood. And I was like, okay, that's amazing. Like, they all kind of work together, and there are some connections there that I think are really interesting. Now, if you're a listener who enjoys a deep dive, this will not be that. But you can definitely listen to some podcasts that do cover it. Obviously, self-promotion here. The Deceptive Co-eds episode that I did on True Crime Cases is out there for the Porco and Powell case specifically. And then there are a ton of great podcasts out there who have covered the Lululemon case. It's going to be, my recommendation obviously would be Gen Y if you like kind of a discussion. The Sisters Who Kill podcast. There's so many other. Mama Mysteries has done it. So many podcasts to select from. But the first case we're going to dive into is the Chris Porco case. This happened back in 2004, around November 15th. And so this occurred in Delmar, New York, which is really funny because I think Jay is on from J Boy Nation. If you are on YouTube or familiar with him, He has an incredible channel and an incredible following of people. I was on his show recently, and I had him read for the podcast actually, and I was really like wanting to have a New Yorker on there because this whole case, I mean, when you look back at the YouTube videos of the interrogation and then the investigators kind of doing follow-ups, they all have these really very thick, like Long Islandy accents and everything. And so I was just like, I want people to feel what this was like. But this involves the Porco family, right? So the Porco family consisted of Peter, who was a law clerk to a man named Judge Cardona, and he had two sons with his wife, Jonathan, who was the eldest, and Christopher, who was the youngest. Now, both of those sons did not live at home at the time the attacks and murder occurred. The reason that the murder was initially discovered was because Peter, who had been a law clerk essentially for Judge Cardona, who was a district judge, he was extremely timely, always, showing up to work on time, rarely missed a day. If he did, he was communicating ahead of time. Everybody knows somebody like that who's just like, those perfect attendance kids at school turn into perfect attendance people at work and never miss a day, right? That was Peter. So when he was discovered as not being at work, people were really concerned, especially those he worked with and Judge Cardona. So he ends up sending a court officer to go and check on him. He says, "Listen, I really want to make sure he's okay. Who knows? Could have been that he overslept and he didn't think it was possible, but you know, stranger things have happened." So the officer ends up going, and the first thing he notices when he gets to the front door is that there's a key in the lock and the door is kind of pushed open just a little bit. And he's like, this is really strange. So he pushes the door open. And when he walks in, he's immediately met because it's one of those houses where you walk into the foyer and you see the staircase immediately kind of leading up to the second story. So at the end of the stairs, Peter is drenched in blood. He's like essentially collapsed on himself and he's just drenched in blood on the staircase. So he goes, checks for a pulse, and realizes that Peter's beyond help. He's already deceased. And he realizes that, Joan might be in the house. So he does a quick cursory view on the bottom floor and then runs upstairs. And he walks into the master bedroom and he sees Joan Porco, or what who he believes to be Joan Porco, Joan Porco, because she's not really, I mean, like, she's literally been attacked with an axe that's laying right next to her. So you can imagine what she looks like. And if you see pictures of Joan now, you understand the extent of the damage that was done to her face and body. So she was just kind of a mass of blood. And he wasn't sure if she was alive or not, but he ran out of the house to call the police. He called the judge first, and the judge told him to call local law enforcement, which he did. And so immediately, the house is descended upon by law enforcement, and a homicide detective by the name of Detective Bowdish ends up coming up. So while EMTs are helping Joan, kind of taking her vitals, he has kind of this wherewithal instinct to start asking her questions because he notices that she's moaning and she's groaning and things like that. So he recognizes that, hey, maybe she'll be able to answer some questions by, an affirmative nod or something like that. So he starts going through a list of questions like, do you know who did this to you? And she nods her head and he starts going through the family. He's like, was it Peter? Thinking maybe it could have been, an attempt at murder suicide. And she says no. And then he says, is it a family member? She says yes. He asks if it's her older son, Jonathan. She says no. And then he asks if it was Christopher. And then she nods in the affirmative. Now, she's immediately rushed to surgery into the local hospital, and then she's placed in a medically induced coma because of the swelling in her brain and to really just allow her body to heal. So they start going through and forensically evaluating the house, and they see that there is a perfectly cut slash in the window screen to the garage, which, if you've been listening to true crime and you've been watching true crime shows, you recognize a stage scene immediately, right? People who feign, um, robberies and things like that. This is one of those things where, like, I'm going to pull open a drawer and just throw things out neatly and things in, situations like that. So this is the same thing. They immediately notice the cut, and it's too nice. It's too deliberate. It's not anything that, you're quickly, because you're trying to quickly get through. If you're trying to rob somebody's house or you're trying to do that, you're not taking your time. This is something you're doing probably for the thrill of it, and you're going to be, very quick. So they go through, they see that there's, some cuts along the screen, and then they notice that the axe that was hanging in the garage was the one that was found in the bedroom, which again tells them that the person didn't come prepared with a weapon. And it was clear that this was meant to be an attack on the family. So it's odd that somebody wouldn't bring a weapon with them to attack somebody. Now, they end up conducting the autopsy on Peter rather quickly. It's not something that takes a really long time, like you would expect months and months to pass. This is happening rapidly because, again, Joan is alive. She could wake up. She, could be able to name her attacker. So they want to get as much evidence processed as possible. So they end up discovering through the autopsy and kind of how the crime scene is situated that they were both attacked when they were in bed. These attacks happened in the early morning hours of November 14th. So both of them suffered really deep wounds. Obviously, Peter suffered the greatest in terms of fatal wounds and had extensive brain damage. Now, because of the way he was hit in his head and how deep the axe went into his head, it actually altered his brain response to the pain, and he had no clue, like he couldn't process that he had just been attacked. So he ended up falling back asleep. He wakes up with his alarm, and he continues throughout his day. So he wakes up, he brushes his teeth, he empties the dishwasher, he goes and picks up the newspaper. And he ends up locking himself out the door, so he remembers that he has a key under the flower pot, unlocks it. I mean, think about that. He's literally bleeding, right? Gushing blood, because a head wound is any type of head wound is going to be really bloody. Not to be graphic, but that's truly, I want to kind of allow people to picture that. Like, imagine if somebody had just happened to walk by when he was out picking up the newspaper, how much things could have changed for him, you know? So he walks out, locks himself out of the house. He remembers the flower pot key, and then he unlocks the door, walks back in, and that's when he collapses. So he went through a whole routine, packed his lunch, the whole thing. And it's just really insane kind of what your body does, to kind of preserve yourself and your pain. Now, because Detective Bowdish had already asked that question of Joan, Chris Porco was the suspect. So there wasn't really anybody else that they were considering at the time. And some people will say, who believe in Chris's innocence, will say, this is when the tunnel vision started. And this is when they wanted to make the evidence fit the crime, or Chris fit the evidence, right? They wanted to make sure that he was the perpetrator. Now, Chris is a student at the University of Rochester, which is about 3 hours away from their home. Did you go to Rochester?
I did. I went to the
Shut
University of
up.
Rochester. Yeah.
Did
I had
you
a
go
friend
when
who
Chris
lived in the
Porco
Monroe
went?
dorm. Yeah, no, I didn't. I
Oh.
graduated about 10 years before him.
Oh.
And we weren't in the same fraternity either.
Oh,
I
good.
looked that up and I was like, oh my gosh, please don't let him be in my fraternity.
Well, I'm sure he's been expelled, so he's technically not in the fraternity anymore because,
They
frat
have rules
life.
about that.
Yeah.
They have conduct rules.
Yeah, it's kind of
Presumably.
violating those conduct rules. And when you're in a frat for life, unless, of course, you kill people. Then your membership status is revoked.
You're out. Sorry, buddy.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things about how Chris found out, he didn't find out from his family or from the detectives. It was actually through a reporter from the Times-Union who called him and said, hey, what do you think about your parents being dead?
I
And he was
honestly
like,
can't believe that happened.
yeah, it's insane. And he was like, what? What do you mean? And she was like, I'm gonna have to call you back, because she realized that, like, he hadn't been notified. So he ends up calling 911. And if you want to hear that call, you can also go on YouTube, but it's also featured in the episode. But he calls 911 to basically say, I heard my parents are dead. Do you have any information about that? And so that's when he's notified. And I find this part a little interesting in that he didn't drive himself back home. He ended up getting picked up by his uncle and then driven back to the hospital. So at the hospital, he's approached by Detective Bowdish. They had also had to put a bolo out on him just in case, but they saw him at the hospital. They knew he was going to be there. And so they told him to come in for an interview, or would he be willing to come in for an interview? They didn't arrest him. He went voluntarily and he was like, sure.
Yeah, and
What
I
happens
find it do
next?
find it really surprising that he fully cooperated, that he gave them DNA
Oh,
when they asked, he gave them their clothes.
yeah.
He wasn't happy that they wanted to process his car, but I mean, whatever they did. Um, and then they asked him. I mean, he was willing to talk with them. I mean, I
Oh,
guess,
hours. I mean, I have
yeah,
the full transcripts of the interview. It's thousands of pages long.
I've, yeah, I'm surprised, but I mean, maybe I'm not surprised. But they asked him when he had last seen his parents, and I thought this was like this feels like semantics to me. He said a couple of weeks ago, oh, he had been at the house and he had stayed over just a couple of days ago, but he didn't actually see his parents.
Mhm.
Mm.
He was hanging out with his girlfriend, and then he went back to school. And when he went back to his dorm, he couldn't stay in his room because his frat director was sleeping in his bed, and so he slept in the common area.
Yes.
And
See,
so this was
that
like
part
his
is weird.
alibi.
That
Yeah,
part
It's a
is weird.
wild story. It
yeah.
Yeah,
has
because
so
his
much extra
roommate
detail.
was staying in a completely different room at the
Oh,
time, like,
right,
he
right.
wasn't even then in there. So there was a bed that was free. So he easily could have slept in his bed, and the director could have taken his roommate's bed. And I was like, "Why didn't anybody point that piece out? Like, why didn't anybody go, 'Where was your roommate?'" And they asked him that, and he said he was staying somewhere else. And so even the detective didn't follow up and ask, like, "So why didn't you just sleep in your dorm room?"
Yeah.
I think that's weird.
Um, it is like a really, I mean, it's a really weak attempt, I think, in my opinion, at an alibi or an explanation
Yes,
as to what he was up to.
agree.
Um, so I guess when they was talking to the detectives, Chris explained that, he didn't have a job, but where was his money coming from? So that kind of had the detectives thinking that there was some kind of financial motive there. And I guess they found out that his dad, Peter, had co-signed for that yellow Jeep Wrangler
Mhm.
and that he was driving. And they did ask around the dorm, like you said, about that alibi, but no one saw him in the common room where he was sleeping. I guess a bunch of guys were hanging out and they were watching Shrek 2 and they didn't remember seeing.
That's my favorite part of the story,
I know,
Yeah,
I
definitely.
know it
I
was.
know, like, that's
This
what
is
stands out. It's like, guys,
yeah,
it's important it was Shrek too. But
yeah.
John, can you speak to the size of that common area?
So the way Monroe, that dorm is laid out, it's sort of it's like a squished X, and
Mhm,
there are, if I'm remembering it right, there are bedrooms in all the different corners, like doubles, and maybe there's 3 doubles and 1 single, and the center is a large common area. So they're really, I guess it's possible you could come in and just go right to the common area
mhm.
and
But
fall
is it
asleep, but you
possible
couldn't
to
get to your
have
bedroom without
right.
going through the common area. So if someone's sitting there watching Shrek, I mean, Shrek. The first one was good.
Mm,
So I mean, if you're watching like like the second one, which wasn't as good, you
Yeah,
probably noticed somebody walking by you.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
But you also couldn't miss somebody sleeping on a couch there. Like, it's not big enough
yeah.
that you
no,
had, like,
absolutely not.
50 people sitting in there and you'd
Mm-mm,
be like, "Sure, he could have been there." It's not that they didn't see him and he was there, it's that they didn't see him because he wasn't there.
mm-hmm.
And he had to have known that too, and that gets to one of my uh,
Theories?
my theories, or just something that makes me shake my head about this whole
Mhm,
case, which is like these explanations he was offering are very much the most easily debunked claims you can
mhm.
possibly think of.
Yeah. And they were checking this alibi while he was still in the interrogation room. So they were feeding this information real time to the detectives on the scene at the university, which I think is also interesting. It's like they're actively catching you in these lies.
Yeah, for sure. And they started, like we were talking about the financial
Hmm.
issues. It just became really evident that he was like a con man. I mean, he was stealing from his parents. He had stolen their laptops and then sold them on eBay.
Mhm.
And where he had been working at a vet hospital, they had burglaries and he was selling their stuff, that stuff he had stolen on eBay as well. So he's just quite the scam artist. He's just
Mhm.
a total con man. And he even like impersonated his brother at some point and said that, oh, I'm Jonathan. I'm Chris's brother. Chris has died, to get out of paying a refund for something that someone had bought. Yeah, and apparently he was failing. He failed all his classes, and instead of, doing the right thing and trying to work on his grades, he just forged his transcripts so he could be, all A's and B's,
Mhm.
Chris the honor roll. And it really stands out to me that he was such a liar. And I'm not sure if his parents ever believed him or if they just kind of went along with what he was saying, even if they were kind of like, oh, that part's not really clear to me, because
Yeah.
he fooled them about everything.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things. We'll see. I think the similarities there with the Sydney Powell case too. I think it's one of those things um, where he talks about something so convincingly to his parents, and they also don't have proof. Like, he's providing them the transcripts, right? And I don't think that they're thinking, you've forged this. I'm thinking,
Mm-hmm.
wow, I think it would make you honestly probably feel guilty as a parent, thinking your kid is full of shit, and then they hand you
Essentially.
transcripts, A and
Yeah.
B, and you're like, man, I can't believe I thought my kid was, this liar, essentially. So I can imagine that they probably like gaslit themselves in this when it was really Chris doing it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to remember all the facts. So he lost a scholarship or something like that. So he
Yes.
needed to pay for his tuition. And I guess he tried to con his parents that there was some kind of issue that had to do with his grades being bad because a professor lost his final. And because the professor lost the final, the University of Rochester was going to be so generous, right? And just cover his tuition because of their mistake.
God, I wish.
Uh,
That happens. That happens all
That
the
would have,
time.
I'm sure
yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, that's our bad, you guys. Don't worry about tuition. We got it from here.
Yeah.
And to be clear, the University of Rochester, when I went
Yeah.
like a long time ago, it seemed expensive at the time. It was like $20,000 a year. Now it's more like 60,000 a
Oh,
year.
Yeah, it's
wow.
very
So it was
expensive.
probably in the 40,000 a year range when he went. So this, I mean, it's an
Yeah, they're
expensive
not
Yeah, it's
private
shirking
school.
expensive.
40K. Yeah,
Yeah,
no
they're not
way.
going to choke that down.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
Um, yeah. So he asked his parents, okay, let's take out a loan. So I can pay the extra fees that the school won't cover. I just have to pay the fees. Tuition's done. But I have to pay the fees. So they
Mhm.
said, he told them, oh, it's going to be a loan for $2,000, but he accidentally took out a loan of $30,000. So he
Whoops.
paid his
It happens.
tuition,
It happens.
paid his fees, and then bought that Jeep.
Zeros. How do they
Yeah.
work?
And yeah, and he made a mistake. It was a mistake.
Yeah,
Mm.
it was an accounting error.
Yeah.
It was an
Right,
accounting error in
right.
his favor.
Yes. And he didn't bother to correct it.
Right.
Mm-mm.
So yeah, I'm
Um,
always curious how he ends up getting away with things like this.
Mhm.
yeah, and the other thing is, I don't know if he thought he was going to get away with this stuff or like how long he thought he could keep this grift going, but
Mhm.
he forged his father's signature to secure the loan and then ghosted his parents for weeks and assuming, I guess, that they'd never find out. And again, going to like, how long did you think you could keep this up?
Yeah, it's
Um,
30K.
I mean, do you think Citibank's not going to make the call? Well, it turns out they did,
Yeah.
and they contacted Peter, confirming, the loan, and this, of course, alerted his dad to what was going on. So Peter, who is obviously very upset by this, really frustrated with his son, and is probably starting to wonder what the heck is going on. He emails Chris about it. I don't know if he tried to call first, but he emailed. I don't know. I would
Yeah,
have called.
always calling. Yes.
Yeah. Um, and this is just 2 weeks before his murder, and then again the incident with the yellow Jeep, the
Mhm.
unmistakable, absolutely unmistakable yellow Jeep
Yeah.
that Chris got on eBay. He used his father's funds. He says that he didn't forge that one, but he he definitely got his father to co-sign for that one. Didn't he, scammed his way in, so he probably impersonated his father to get the co-sign on that. His father found out about that, and at that point, his father said, like, listen, if you do this again, I'm going to take legal action, because, by the way, his dad works for a
also
law
went to law
office.
school. Yes.
Yeah. Also went to law school. Not the right person to mess with.
No.
But in a heroic act of solid parenting, signs the email and says, we still love you, but basically you have to cut this out.
Yeah.
So the police start to identify these patterns of behavior, which are very clear. It appeared to me, like, as I was learning about this case, that it was like, there are puzzles that have like 1,000 pieces that have all very similar colors, and it's very difficult to pick out the edges and fit all the pieces together. And then there are some puzzles that have 4 pieces that are like a dog, and you're like, I'm going to fit this puzzle together in 5 minutes. And this is sort of that sort of a puzzle to me.
It was really quick.
It was really quick. Like everything fell apart right away. So back in the day, in the before 4, we had toll booth operators. I don't know if they still have these people that work in the toll booths. It was an
For the people
absolutely
who still need to pay cash when they go through. Yeah.
No, they don't anymore. Not in
I don't
Texas.
think-
Like they
I
just
don't
scan
think
your
so.
license plate.
It makes me
Send
want
you
to
a
drive
bill.
through Western New York again and see if
Just
these
to see
people
what
still
happens,
exist.
yeah.
This was a plum job too. They got like $40 or $50 an hour to stand in those toll booths. Those people fought over those jobs.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, interesting. But so in order to get from Rochester to Delmar, he had to go through a toll booth, because the 90 is the thruway, New York Thruway, is a toll road, which I traveled many times. So they have these cool things called cameras, and they had them in 2000. And toll booth operators, the humans in the booths, remembered the bright yellow Jeep going through the toll booth, and they were able to be questioned about they know who was working when. So they talked to the toll booth operators. At 10:45 p.m., November 14th, the Jeep passed through on the way to on eastbound toward Delmar from Rochester. And then at 2:14 a.m., their security system, the Porco's security system, starts to fill in some more of the gaps and give us, another large puzzle piece. 2:14 a.m., their home security system is disarmed using the code.
I don't know a home invader who's like, I'm gonna guess the master code.
It's a 4-digit code.
But first, let me cut the screen.
I will cut the screen first, just in case.
Throw them off.
So then 5 a.m., November 15th, the Jeep passes back through westbound the toll booth heading to Rochester. And when the police finally impounded and searched his car, they found receipts in his Jeep confirming that it was him. So then it wasn't until 8 a.m. on the 15th that he was seen in his dorm. He said he was there. No one saw him. That's because he wasn't there. So he was arrested for murder in 2005.
And the attempted murder on his mom.
And the attempted murder.
Because
right.
Joan survives this attack, right? She comes out of her coma, but I think one of the interesting things about this, and I don't think I mentioned this in the beginning when we talked about it, but the thing about Joan, and one of the things I find interesting about that in particular and how it leads into the Powell case eventually, is the fact that she wakes up and the detectives go, "Do you remember what you said about Chris?" And she's all like, "No." And they tell her, like, "You said Chris is the one who did this to you." And she's like, I don't have any recollection of it, but I don't believe that would happen. Like, I don't believe that Chris could have done this. And it's not that a remembrance of, yes, I know he didn't do it. It's an I believe he did not. So unwavering support of her son still to this day. Like, she does not believe that Chris is the one who committed the crime. Like, she stands by his side. And I find that part so interesting, because I think that would be so hard to do as a parent when the evidence to me is so overwhelming.
And I wonder if it's just the fact that her brain won't let her believe that her son would do this to her and her husband.
Yeah.
Because at the time she definitely said,
yeah,
it was Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Lanie, did they have any other suspects? Because
No.
you said they had. Okay, so
they thought it could have been Jonathan, because he was also away, but he was, I think, in North Carolina at on base, because he was in the military. He was in the Navy. And so they thought it could have been him, but then they checked his alibi, nothing. They did know about the burglaries that were reported, but then once the information about Chris selling this stuff on eBay, and it being literally tied to his eBay account,
Yeah.
they were like, okay, there's no other motive here. The only person who stood to gain anything from any of this happening was Chris.
And one of the things that we learned was that he consistently bragged that he was going to be getting a substantial inheritance once his parents passed away.
Mhm.
So, I mean,
Wow.
that's absolutely clear motive. He's having money problems. He's bragging about his large
Mhm.
inheritance. So, also the fact that his father is now catching him in the act and threatening him with consequences, from
Yeah.
all the stealing.
Yeah,
And of
it's like
course, yeah,
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's it makes sense that the police would stop looking. There are
Mhm.
definitely instances where that bias comes in and you think to yourself, I can't believe the police are still looking at this guy. Their bias is taken over and this is not the guy. And it turns out that it's not eventually. And they won't look at any other suspects. But in this case, it seems the evidence was just so
Overwhelming.
overwhelming that, like,
Yes.
why would they look at somebody else? So despite the fact that his mom supported him and said, couldn't have been him, um, he was found guilty and given a minimum sentence of 50 years in prison. And
Yeah.
he has made appeals on some different and
Grounds.
kind of sketchy grounds, but none have
Mhm.
been successful. So he is currently living out most of the rest of his life in prison.
Yeah. It's crazy. I mean, so I don't know. I think we've already kind of touched on this, but to me the evidence is super compelling. Like even going through the transcripts of the interview, I think definitely highlights his ability to make an excuse for everything. And if I'm been obsessively watching the Charlie Adelson, trial, as you guys have probably seen, but
Mhm.
Georgia, the prosecutor had a really great opening when she or closing statement and was like, even when she questioned Charlie and was like, for you, the simplest answer is not the correct answer. For you, you have an excuse for everything. Like, don't you think that that's demonstrating that you have something to hide, that you aren't telling the truth?
Mm.
And for Chris, it's the same thing. It's like he had an answer for everything. I didn't forge my dad's signature because I didn't technically sign it. I pressed a button and it was an electronic signature. So I technically didn't forge it, right? It's all
Mm.
electronic. So it was all semantics in that sense. Like, did I physically forge my dad's signature? No. Um, the bragging about the inheritance, same thing. I was a oops, sorry. I was a dumb kid. I was just being braggadocious. I was dumb. I made mistakes, but would I kill my parents? No. Joan wrote a letter as a part of his appeal in support of him. She wrote a letter to the Times-Union, basically saying that people are wasting their time convicting Chris, and they should be looking for Peter's real killer. And to me, it's kind of shameful that all roads point to Chris, in my opinion. And it's shameful, I think, that Chris is allowing his mother to live with this being an unknown in her life. Like, I really wish that he would just come clean
Just admit
and
it.
say, like, "I did
Mhm.
it. I'm sorry I did it." Even apologize. Like, you can't take it back, but at least give her the peace to know, it's done. And that's kind of why I selected, out of the many cases that could have
Mhm.
been selected next, why I selected the Sydney Powell case. It was also a case I was watching actively on YouTube because it just concluded, right? She was just sentenced to, spoiler alert. Um,
Mhm.
but she reminded me, like, as soon as I finished watching her case, and she was found guilty, again, spoiler alert, I immediately was like, "Man, that sounds a lot like Grand Amato. That sounds a lot like Chandler Halderson." And I've covered them too because I've always been fascinated by these people from a very psychological perspective of why you think lying is going to prevent the truth from coming out. and why you think murdering people is going to prevent the truth from coming out. Like
Yeah.
the most obvious suspects, right? Grant Amato, same thing. Chandler Halderston, same thing. Chris Porco, Sydney Powell, the most obvious suspects. Sydney's case is a little bit different. But I just always go, was it worth this secret? I mean, the secret was revealed anyway. And now you've also killed your parent or you've killed your family. So that's why I selected the Sydney Powell case. Now, this happened in 2020, so fairly recently in Ohio. Um, the interesting thing here is that there's nothing of note in Sydney's childhood, right? There's nothing of note that would stand out when you go through this case and go, that's it. That's the turning point. Like you would for Chris, right? You would go, okay, he's been actively doing these things and lying and covering it up. That's not the case really for Sydney. She has a younger sibling who we don't talk about, obviously, because he was a minor at the time when the crime occurred, but she is the daughter of Stephen and Brenda Powell. Steve had worked at this place called Akron Steel Treating Company for such a really long time, like over 20 years. Brenda, same thing at the Akron Children's Hospital. They had been members of this community and ingrained in this community for such a long period of time. Like they raised their children there. They grew up in that area. So they they were really important, I would say, to their neighbors and everybody around them. Like they had established themselves. They'd also been married for 24 years, which kudos to them because you don't hear about that
Good job.
happening too often. How long have you guys been together?
We've been together like 10, 11 years.
Yeah.
And
12.
Yeah.
married like 5.
Yeah.
6, 5,
Yeah.
Oh my
6. I
gosh.
should know that.
Wait,
I should know that.
you should know that. When did you get married?
5. 2018. It was 5.
2018.
Yeah.
So right
it was
after
5
me.
years.
July
crazy.
8th.
July 8th, 2018.
Boom.
Wow.
Nice.
See?
Yeah.
Nice.
I
You
remember
won.
that because we didn't get married 7/7 because of everything was booked because 7/7.
7/7. Yeah. Oh, lucky 7.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you don't hear about that. I've been around with my husband about the same time. Together almost 10 years and then married 7, I think. No, I don't know how long we've been married. Since
It's a good run. We'll
2017,
make it
maybe.
24.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope so, right? I
Yeah.
have no desire
Yeah.
to divorce because there's literally nobody else on the planet who could deal with me.
People are the
And he
worst.
actively chose to like procreate with me. So I was like, you crazy. You crazy, and I have to stay with you. But so the Powells, again, nothing of Sydney's childhood. Up until she went to college, she had a quote unquote normal childhood, very stable. She was, high GPA in high school, friendly, introverted in some respects until you got to know her. I call those people like ambiverted, right? Like they're really outgoing with their close friends, but in a bigger group, they're a little bit more introverted. Now, the Powells use this app. I've never used it in my life, but I know many people who do. Use the Life 360 app, which is kind of like the Find My Friends feature on an iPhone, but I think a little bit more sophisticated because it can actually send you like alerts and things like that. Have you guys ever used that before?
I haven't, but it came up in the research we did for one of our Tech Corner episodes about stalking.
Oh, really?
Interestingly, because
Yeah.
Can you use it without people knowing?
So abusers often put stalkerware on their significant other's phone. So like Shaun works at a domestic violence shelter, so that's one of the things that when people enter the
people show
shelter,
up,
you
you
got
have to make sure
sure
they turn off all location finding just to be extra be safe. Because I guess that's kind of the point. Like I guess if you had a Life 360, you have to remember to kick people off of it. I mean, I feel like Sydney kind of forgot that her parents could see where
Yeah,
she was at all times based on
Yes.
her behavior later as it comes up and stuff. So
I agree.
I think
So,
you have to
yeah.
be careful who has access. Yeah.
I do think there is a good use case for that app though.
Mm.
I feel like it's a little bit helicoptery from a
Mhm.
parenting perspective, but I get it. I get
Oh,
that
yeah.
urge because we definitely have like Find My Fellow
Friends.
Humans set up on our phones,
Yeah,
and it's like really useful. Like
it
be
is.
informed
I mean,
when
I do it for
get home, or
everybody. Yeah.
Mhm.
Even traveling and stuff like that, like with the friends I'm traveling with. So like when we went to the Studio Both and opening back in
oh yeah,
up in Massachusetts, we were all staying at the same house and we were all traveling together. So I was like, I want to make sure in case anybody like wanders off in this super quaint town, that I know where they're at. And, like I want to be a responsible friend too. So if anything does happen, I want to know like where they were. And I also want
Mhm.
them to know where I am in case, something happens to me or whatever.
Mhm.
So I'm the same boat. Like I get the purpose of it. I am insanely paranoid about safety and security and all that stuff. So I am happy to use everything,
Yeah.
but I think it's also a fair warning for people who are in relationships or engaged in behavior that is not healthy. That this app can not be a great thing for them. But for the Powells, they were using it really to make sure their kids were okay. They used it for their minor son. They used it for Sydney. And it was just a way for all of them to kind of keep track with it with each other. So it's 10:30 on the morning of March 3rd. And Sydney was supposed to be at school in the university. I think she was like an hour and a half away. But the Life 360 app ends up pinging Steve and Brenda saying, like, hey, Sydney just showed up at home. And they're like, well, this is strange. You should be at school. Like, spring break hasn't happened. Spring break was the next week. And they're like, you should definitely be at school. So why are you here? Right. Um, but there was something that had happened earlier that day where they received a call from the university. Steve and Brenda received a call from the university to say, like, hey, that check you sent, we are going to end up sending it back because Sydney's no longer enrolled. And they're like, that's weird.
Hmm.
So Steve's like, I'm going to go home and talk to Sydney about this. And I think one of the interesting things, even though he is staunchly on his daughter's side in terms of supporting her and everything and wanting her home, he ends up leaving his phone at work so that Sydney's not alerted to the fact that he left work and is on his way home. And to me, I think that's really telling, you know, that,
Like he could tell something was off.
yeah, that he's
Mhm.
like, I don't want to alert her. So I'm just going to say, I'm just going to show up to the house, which is what he does. They have a conversation, according to him, and his testimony. Oh my gosh. His testimony is so heartbreaking, because he's having a dual perspective of the shoulda, woulda, coulda that I think is a knife to the heart, really. Of not only do you have the if I would have stayed, I could have maybe prevented this. And if I would have had a conversation and not told Brenda to go to the house, I could have prevented that. So you can see that scene playing in his head, and it's devastating to watch. It's devastating to see him go through that, and you really feel for him in that moment when you're watching him testify on the stand. It's incredibly heartbreaking. Um, but he goes home to speak to her. They go through everything. Sydney starts telling him, like, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I feel like a loser. I feel like I don't have anything planned out. And he's being really gracious and supportive with her and telling her, like, listen, not a lot of people at your age have their life figured out or know what they want to do. It's totally fine. Like, we will figure it out. There's a way to move forward. Um, we just got to call the school. So, your mom's going to come home. He says they had a really great relationship. So, I'm going to call your mom. She's going to come home. You guys can work it out, talk to your mom about it, and let's see what happens. He calls Brenda and he tells her, and she's like, okay, I'll head home. So, Brenda ends up calling back the university. She gets a voicemail and she says, hey, I need you to give me a call back so we can talk about what's going on with Sydney. And Steve goes back to work. So she last contacted him, Brenda did, at 12:30, sending him a text saying, like, hey, I just pulled up. So between 12:30 and 12:40, the university ends up calling Brenda back and saying, like, hey, I wanted to talk to you about Sydney and just kind of answer as many questions as I possibly can. Because, once your kid's an adult and they go to university, this isn't like high school. You can't just go and ask, about their grades or ask about anything. Their information's private, even to their parents. So, they have to have permission from Sydney to discuss these things. Now, when they get on the phone and they have this really brief kind of conversation of like salutations and saying, like, hey, yeah, we're going to talk about this, they end up hearing some screaming and yelling and a couple of loud thuds. And then the call is disconnected. They keep calling her name. They keep calling Brenda's name and stuff. And the call eventually, like I said, is disconnected. So they call back at least 3 times. On the 3rd time, the person picks up and they go, "Is this Brenda?" And the person on the other line goes, "Yes." And they instantly kind of get this chill down their spine and go, "Sydney, we know this is you." And then the phone hangs up. So that's when they call the police to say, like, you should do a welfare check at this address. We heard some commotion and some yelling and screaming. So we think that, something's going on or somebody's been injured. We don't know for sure. So this call goes out on the radio and a person calls Steve, like an officer that they knew, ends up calling Steve and says, like, "Hey, something's going on at your house," or whatever. So he ends up calling Sydney. We'll get into that a little bit, but I watched the body cam photo of when they first approach the house and everything,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they end up coming up to the house. It's so weird to watch, and everything's blurred, which is great. But they walk up to the house, and you hear Sydney. They open the door. She kind of comes running out at the same time. She's yelling at them to help her mom. Her hands are covered in blood. She's shaking. She's saying, like, the officer's trying to calm her down, also getting her outside until, she starts saying, somebody broke in and my mom told me to get out and I ran outside, but then I heard my mom screaming. So I ran back inside and doesn't say, of course, which way the person went, how they left the house or anything like that. But she says, like, I came back and my mom was lying in a pool of blood. They end up finding Brenda in the master bedroom, and next to her is a frying pan, like a cast iron frying pan, essentially, and a steak knife that was still embedded in her body, like in her neck. She had so many stab wounds, blunt force trauma to her head, and she was still breathing when the officers arrived. EMTs end up taking her to the hospital, and she's pronounced dead when she arrives. So Steven, you see him kind of drive up, right? Because he had already been alerted by his officer
No.
friend. You see him drive up and he's telling them what he could about this, about Sydney and about Brenda. And they're asking him, does she have any mental health issues? And he's like, no, like Brenda was supposed to call the school. He was so confused. Um, and he didn't know what was going on. And you find out later that this friend of his in the police force hears the radio call to his address and calls him and says, "Hey, I think there's something going on at your house." And he's like, "Oh, let me call Sydney and let me call Brenda." He calls Brenda, no answer. He tries her again, no answer. He calls Sydney. She answers the phone, according to him, very calm, and is like, "Hello," you know?
Mhm.
And he's like, "Well, is everything okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, mom is on the phone with the school," which at the time Brenda had already been stabbed and was dying on the floor. Um, and she's like, "Yeah, mom's talking on the phone with the school." And he goes, "Oh, okay. Well, officer so and so just called me and said that they have officers, police going to the house because of a commotion or something." And then instantaneously she changes and she starts freaking out, screaming, and she says, "Somebody broke in. I was down in the basement and mom screamed at me to run, get out of the house. Somebody came." And so he was just like, can you imagine like the emotional whiplash that's happening there when you're like, "Yeah, everything's fine. Oh my God." Like that's how quick it happened for him. And
Wow.
she started saying, somebody had broken in. So that whole thing happened. What happens after that?
Um, you mentioned that he told the police that she didn't have any mental health issues, that she was struggling in school, but, things were getting worked out.
Mhm.
And, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, I mean, was he in denial when he said that, or did he not notice, or what, did he just never see that in her? But her reaction was that she collapsed to the ground and he had to comfort her. She kind of went like unresponsive, like catatonic, and
Yes.
she was like tapping her head against the concrete. And they had her taken to the hospital and put under a psychiatric hold. And um, yeah, that while she was there, she told them what had happened to her and her mom. And her story was that she heard glass shatter in the basement because someone was breaking in, and then she blacked out. And when she regained consciousness, she found a knife in her mother's neck. And She did everything she could to stop the bleeding, but this is in direct conflict with that phone call you just talked about. It doesn't make any sense at all. Um, so to doctors, they see that there's a number of issues that she's going through. They said that she appeared to be having she was in a psychotic state, and it was likely that she had schizophrenia and a depressive disorder, and that she, like so many people do, she was able to hide the signs from those around her and
Mhm.
to appear um neurotypical. She was a perfectionist though, and she had a deep fear of failure. It just wasn't an option for her. Um, so given all of this, immediately after she left the hospital, she was charged under suspicion of murder, and she was released on bail just 2 days later. But I think the big question is, why did this happen? Why did she do this? Why did she attack her mom? Like you said, they had a really close family. Her mom was like her best friend. I think they said that they were really tight. And they never had any fights or arguments, or at least, none that anyone knew about. Um, and like you said, Sydney was pretty reserved. She could be anxious, but she was chatty with her friends. And yeah, she was a perfectionist and probably had a large amount of anxiety when it came to wanting to meet her goals. There's no way she was going to fail. She didn't want anyone to see her as failing. So she was an honor student. She earned a scholarship to the university she was at, but it seems like that change between high school life and college life was a real challenge for her.
Yeah.
And her grades were not where they had been in high school. She only had a 2.2, so she had been placed on probation. And she just didn't tell her parents. I don't know why. I mean, I understand that she was afraid of admitting to them that she had messed up, but
Yeah.
she pretended like nothing had happened and kind of withdrew. She withdrew from friends, stopped going to school. And of course they suspended her from school, but she was like still um living on campus and just kind of making up stories even for those folks about something with like some issue with her brother, and that's why she couldn't go home, and it just kind of snowballed for her.
Yeah.
And
It was
eventually,
really sad
they forced her to out
to
of the
move
dorm,
out.
and that's
Yeah.
why she was home on March 3rd. It's amazing that she
Mhm.
got through almost half a semester faking it like that. It's
Yeah,
pretty
it's
amazing.
amazing. They kept giving her, they kept
Yeah.
saying, "Listen, Sydney, you're no longer enrolled here. We'll give you a few more days, and then but you have to get out of the dorms."
Mhm.
And she was like, "Yeah, yeah, I'm working on it. I'm working on it." And she like stayed as long as she could.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it seemed like the pressure had been building in her for a long time, like the pressure that she put on herself. It doesn't seem to me like her parents put a lot of pressure on her, although I don't know that for sure. But it
Yeah.
seems like she put a lot of pressure on
Mhm.
herself. And then, like you said, that transition to college is tough, man.
It is.
I
Yeah.
know when I went to college, there was like for example, I'll give you an example. So I thought I was super smart in high school. Can- like this, maybe a little smart. So
Yeah.
I took an AP calculus class. I love telling the story. I told our son that because he took some
Jeez.
AP classes. So I took AP calculus, not the hard one. There are two. I took the easier one, and I was
Okay.
like, and I did well. Like I was like, yeah, I get this, whatever. So I was doing engineering in at the University of Rochester. What's up? Whoop, whoop.
Shout out.
And when I got there, they allowed me the opportunity to not take the first calculus class, but take the second one that you take as a sophomore. So like actually the third class. So I passed
Mhm.
out of a year of calculus, and that class kicked my ass so hard. Like I
Knocked you
like
down a few pegs.
like nothing I had ever experienced in my life. I remember I walked into the class, this
Oh,
giant
no.
auditorium, and I was like, holy crap, all these people. I was the youngest one there, except for like the few other people who had taken the AP and passed out. And the
Yeah.
professor like did not care. He was like, all right, second year people, here we go. Blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh, I'm in such trouble right now.
Oh,
So yeah,
no.
the transition can be really, really
Yeah.
tough. But I was very honest and upfront with my family about it. Sydney was not. She didn't get the help she needed.
Mhm.
It seems like she didn't come clean with her family. Even after she was gone from the university, she was like couch surfing and staying with her friends. just
Mhm.
waiting for classes to be done. Again, like absolute deep denial going on, not just a river in Egypt. Super, super deep denial.
Mhm.
And it seemed to me that if you're couch surfing and you know you're out, like this indicates an awareness that what you're doing is wrong and potentially very sketchy and that you are definitely lying.
Yeah.
So when she got home and she was confronted by her dad first on the phone and then by her mother calling the university, you know, like I said, it seemed like the pressure had been building for a while. I'm not a psychiatrist, but it seems like at some point pressure can only build so much, and it seemed like there was definitely a snapping
moment,
action
yeah.
that
Mhm.
happened, and it all just came out.
Mhm.
So that was when she finally had to like, she'd been denying the truth for so long,
Yeah.
and her mental state had been deteriorating for so long that it just came out.
Yeah.
But similar to the first case we talked about, her father, Stephen, was also in denial. And he is just, acting as her advocate. He doesn't want her to be charged for murder.
Mhm.
It, it, he obviously knows that she did it because the evidence is there, but he believes she's unwell, even though, of course, he, was not aware of it before and that it wasn't her fault, which I think in this case, you can actually argue that she was
Yeah.
unwell. I
Yes.
think there's a
She does.
legitimate case for that
Yes,
here.
Yeah.
she for sure has some mental health issues, right? Has been diagnosed, is being treated still to this day, right? Like she wouldn't have been held in a psychiatric ward if she didn't, right? She
Right.
stayed there
Yep.
for a while. So yeah, I definitely I think way different than the Porco case in terms of motive, right?
Hmm.
And the rationale and stuff like that behind it. So for sure, yeah, I agree.
Right. It definitely seemed like the premeditation was absolutely not there with her, and it seems like it definitely was there
Mhm.
with the Porco
Chris,
case.
yeah.
Mhm.
Especially because, like you said, they medicated her, and at one point her medication was clearly at the wrong dosage because she expressed to her grandmother that she was like having these feelings again, and they changed her dosage, and they saw improvement in her condition. So it seems
Mhm.
like pretty clear evidence that um, you know has to do with her mental state. That, of course, spoiler, did not convince the authorities. So she was indicted on murder charges, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. Of course, because she decided to tamper with the evidence and stage the scene.
Mhm.
She pled not guilty, as you do, I guess. But they later amended it to not guilty by reason of insanity, which I think is getting closer to
What was
that's
Yeah.
going on with her? Yeah.
probably the
Yeah.
thing. And saying that she only killed her mother due to a psychotic break. And her father, this poor man, this poor family, he's testified. He said, "This isn't what anyone wants here. I don't know how she can handle it." Which fair,
Right.
fair. I
Mhm.
don't know how I can handle it. I'm just trying to keep my family together. You see these stories all the time, and the result is the family is utterly destroyed, right?
Mhm.
The prosecution, unmoved. Um, they don't feel like there's any proof that she was legally insane at the time of murder. I feel like that's a topic for another podcast that I'm not qualified to address,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I have someone for you if you're interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, the
Mhm.
Um,
legal burden is much different than us just having, the layman's understanding of insanity and what that means. Like,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
there's a whole, Bob Motto, one of my dear friends,
Love
goes
Bob.
on and
Shout out
on
to
about
Bob.
it, I love
Yeah,
but yeah, same, yeah, huge, wholly different than, just knowing somebody's insane, like, or having mental health issues. I don't like saying insane.
yeah. It does occur to me. It does seem to me though that if this is your defense,
Mhm,
you need to line up your expert witnesses that can prove that this is the case. And unfortunately, they
mhm,
were not
Mhm.
able to do that.
yeah,
But they did. There was one expert that testified that he had rarely, if ever, seen a situation where an individual was in such an utterly compromised psychological state as Sydney Powell, as she was at the time of the offenses, which I think is a fair thing to say. And I'm not
mhm,
sure you need a psychology degree to come up with that, but absolutely, I totally agree. She was, as you mentioned, found guilty on all 4 counts, and she was sentenced to 15 years. Interesting when you compare that 15 years to the 50 years that Chris Porco
Porco got.
received.
Yeah.
right,
Interesting. So it seems like they may have considered that a mitigating factor.
Yeah.
On September 28th, really recently, she was sentenced.
Yeah.
Everybody, her full family, understandably devastated. Stephen, her father, still adamant this is not what Brenda, would have wanted.
What I wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Still, I mean, truly. I think kind of the shining light is that she likely won't serve the full 15 years. If she is granted parole and stuff like that, if she starts making, adjustments and things like that, I'm hoping that she's continuing treatment. I hope that, the prison
Hope so.
system does that for her. I have a little bit more empathy for Sydney than I do, obviously, for Chris.
Absolutely.
And I think truly, as a parent, I look at myself, or I try and put myself in Joan's shoes, and I try and put myself in Stephen's shoes. But Sydney's case was really difficult to see black and white for me. Chris is easy, right? It's like, come on, dude. But with Sydney's, there was so much there, and I think the mental health care that, if you want to use that word, super lacking in our country and stuff like that. And I don't know um how true it is that they didn't know about Sydney's thing. She could have just been really great at hiding it, but I think as a parent, intuitively you do know when something's up with your kid or when they're not doing something. Brenda and Sydney had text exchanges that weren't so nice to each other, where there was some
Yep.
some trust that was lacking on both of their sides and stuff. But I think Sydney's dad talking on behalf of his wife um, was really devastating to me, because I couldn't imagine being in that position to try and be the voice for my spouse who's deceased. For me, love of my life. They were together 24 years, and then your child, who you would likely lay your life down for, or switch places with them in an instant, trying to save somebody. And the complete helplessness that you can see he feels when he's testifying or when he's speaking about this, I wish I could hug him, because it's really sad. And I'm glad that in some way, even though it's a 15 years to life sentence, I don't think that she will serve the full term. I think she will be granted parole, probably within 7 to 8 years, because, good behavior and everything trims a lot of time down. So hopefully, she does that and as well. But yeah, so I understand not putting a ton of leniency on that case, because again, precedence means that if this happens again and if somebody uses the same excuse, then that could change it for other people. But now we're going into the Norwood case, the Lululemon murders case. I know not a lot of people like it to be said that, but colloquially, that's how it's known within the true crime community. But yeah, I think I would love for you to share why you selected this case as a kind of third string to these last two cases we covered.
I guess it jumped out at me. I mean, there's a couple things that I see are similar, and as we get into the details, I think I hope that everyone else sees what I see. But I mean, Chris and Sydney and Brittany Norwood, I mean, they're all kind of around the same age,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems like their motive for the murders are similar in some ways. And like I said, some of the other details that they lean into in their stories, they just kind of seem similar to me. I think that's why that one jumped out at me.
Yeah, I
Um
saw it. So
yeah, this crime, I mean, it's called the Lululemon murders because murder because it happened at a Lululemon store in Bethesda Row, Maryland, in March 12th, 2011. So a worker arrived at the Lululemon store to open it up, when her shift started, and she heard a noise inside. So she got nervous and she asked, a guy outside, like, "Hey, will you help me search what's going on in the store?" And the store was an absolute bloodbath.
mm,
There were two bodies in the back of the store. They called the police, and when the police arrive, they discovered one of the two victims was still alive. Both of these people, they're both employees at the store. So Brittany Norwood, she's 27 years old. She was bound by zip ties in the bathroom, in the back of the store. She's alive. She's badly bruised and she's bloody. But 30-year-old Jana Murray was dead. She was badly beaten in a pool of blood, a ligature around her neck, and just an awful, horrific scene. But they take Brittany to the hospital and she's able to tell detectives what had happened. So she said at the night before, when her and Jana were locking up the store, Brittany forgot her wallet inside. So she called Jana and she was like, "Hey, you have the keys to the store, manager. Will you open the door for me so I can get my wallet?" So the alarm or the records showed that the door was open to the store at 10:05. And Brittany said two ski masked men followed them inside to rob them, and they were wearing gloves and dark clothes, and one was about 6 feet tall and one was shorter. The women they were beaten, they were sexually assaulted, and Brittany was left lying on the bathroom floor where she passed out from everything that had happened. And Brittany said that the men did not kill her because this is like awful to say, but she was more fun to have sex with. So the police began. I mean, this is in a, I guess, like
Retail
you call it, almost
center.
like a strip mall, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of other stores there, and it was like a place where folks would go like for dinners or drinks or whatever. So the police start asking around, like, "Hey, were you here last night? What did you see?" And there should have been plenty of people seeing, people coming and going. But they didn't really find anything. So they offered a $150,000 reward for anyone who could come forward with information. And the stores, obviously, they wanted to make sure their employees were safe and everything. So they put in security cameras around the area and hired security guards to escort the workers back and forth to their cars. Like, everyone was on high alert in this complex. And next door to the Lululemon was an Apple store. And the employees there said that the night before they believed they heard two women arguing, but they weren't sure that it was anything worth calling the police about, so they didn't. And yeah, like I said, there was no witnesses found who saw the two women get forced inside the store or anything like that. Guys running from the scene, nothing like that.
So this reminds me a lot of the Porco case because of the yarn that is being spun, and we will now observe how the yarn just falls apart. It's another 4-piece puzzle.
Yeah.
So they
really
start,
like
of course.
That analogy.
It's a dog. So they start doing forensic analysis, as you do.
Yeah.
Even in 2011, as you do, to make progress and find out what the heck happened. And what they found didn't make any sense, was completely inconsistent with the story that was being told. There were sets of bloody footprints. One of the two sets could be found throughout the store. One matched Brittany's shoes, and the other was matched to a pair of shoes that was still at the scene. It was like a large pair of shoes, like a size 14 pair of shoes. That okay. And there wasn't a blood trail that left the store. Okay, interesting. And Brittany's injuries were also called into question. So the way they described it is that she had sort of superficial wounds, just cuts and bruises. She had a head wound that bled a lot. If you've ever had a head wound, I've had a head wound. I bumped the crap out of my head one time when I was like 16. Oh, did that bleed? It was crazy. These things really bleed. But none of her injuries, would have
not knocked her out or anything. Yeah.
And the way they analyzed it, they realized that all of the injuries could have been self-inflicted and done while she was standing. So there was no evidence that she should have been unconscious or anything. So they were kind of wondering, like, well, given all this, why did you not get up when you could? Jane, on the other hand, had been brutally beaten and had like 330 injuries from a dizzying array of weapons, including knives and hammers, probably from a toolbox that was left, inside the store. Horrifying. And examination showed that there was no evidence of sexual assault. And again, back to the idea of the Porco case, where where these people make claims that are
Disproven.
can absolutely be just, that will fall apart incredibly fast. So there's no evidence of sexual assault on either woman, although the crotch of Jana's pants had been cut with scissors to make it look like that was the case. So Jana's car was also part of the crime scene that was checked over, and it was weirdly parked 3 blocks away rather than right near the store, as you would when you work at a store, which didn't really make sense because she was just kind of running back there for a minute to help Brittany get back in the building. And also weirdly, blood was found in the vehicle. So, very strange. And even worse, testing of the blood in her vehicle indicated that it was a mixture of Brittany and Jana's blood. So, like I said, 4-piece puzzle. When she was confronted with that finding, when Brittany was, she admitted that she moved the car on the order of the 2 intruders, the 2 hoodie-wearing intruders. Apparently, they threatened to kill her if she didn't return in 10 minutes.
And I'm like, how?
A lot of questions there. If you're in a car, why not just drive away?
Yeah.
Why not go to the police? Did not make sense. So detectives, of course, are hesitant to question a survivor of assault like that, which makes sense. But the inconsistencies were really piling up at that point. So a wealth of circumstantial evidence implicating Brittany, and like right on the border of not so circumstantial anymore.
Yeah.
So a week later, she was charged with first-degree murder, and eventually the truth came out. So at the end of the shift, Brittany and Jana had checked each other's bags because that's what you do when you work at a retail store. Apparently, I've not worked at a retail store.
Me either.
Shauna?
I was like, I don't know retail life like that.
Shaun likes to give me a hard time and tell me that I've worked in every sort of job.
I guess you
I would
haven't.
never work in retail.
But
I'd
it's
rather
funny
work
because
serving
like
tables.
I kind of did in college. Bath and Body Works. I don't know if they still do this, but they did in the 90s. When they changed the store over for Christmas, they like do like an all night thing where they just replace all the merchandise. So it's like magical. You come there the next day and it's all Christmas. So they would hire college kids to come and work overnight and switch out the product. But no one checked my bag when I left to see if I'd taken anything.
And
So
you
I
were
don't.
like, I took so many.
I was like all the lotions.
All the
So many
candles.
we're still using the lotion.
Right.
Yeah, 10-finger
Years ago.
discount.
So it turned out that she had a pair of leggings in Brittany's bag, and Jana called the store manager, and they said they'd deal with it in the morning. So Brittany's managers had suspected her of stealing before, but this was the first time they had any proof. It was later revealed that she had lied and stolen from friends and family and businesses, like hair salons. And Brittany didn't know that Jana had already told management, so she panicked and hatched an absolutely horrible plan to get away with this and keep her job, to keep her retail job. Fantastic. So she called Jana back to the store, attacked her, choked her to death with that ligature, and then staged the store to look like a robbery, moved her car, and then staged herself as another victim. I don't know where she got the zip ties. I'm not sure who keeps zip ties with them, but
they were in the store.
Oh,
they were in the supply closet.
Oh, I guess for putting.
Like you know how you with some of the clothing and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I
keep
was gonna
the
say if
shoes
you
together.
keep zip ties with you,
I mean,
look in the
technically,
mirror
yes,
and
I
figure
do.
out why that is. You'd probably.
I have a
unless you're in
little
retail.
container of zip ties in my car, but
You don't carry
for
them with you.
purposes.
And are they like they're not like these zip ties. They're not.
No.
For,
They're like
humans.
I mean,
That's good.
yeah, no. I have a thing that I've rigged up for my kids since the back of my car doesn't have air vents, which is crazy to me. It's only in the front, and stuff. So I have this like long tubey thing that connects to the air vent in
That
the
is
front
so cool.
and like
smart.
goes over her. So because it's Texas, and gets
Right.
super hot. So yeah, I have zip ties in there for that. In case
I like your alibi.
Thank you.
Explanation solid.
I've worked on it. I've worked on it.
Yeah,
I've had time to think about
You're
it.
practiced. You're not the level of liar that Chris Porco is.
I'm better.
So those Apple employees, when they testified, they said that they heard Jana saying, "Talk to me, don't do this," and then "God help me."
That's so sad.
Yeah, horrifying.
And crazy that you would not call the police on the God.
Yeah, they reported that they thought it was just drama.
And the security guard was also there.
Just
like
drama.
I've seen the I've listened to a ton of podcasts about it too, but have seen when they cover the case, like on ID and stuff like that, like they're sitting in the store, like scrolling on an iPad or an iPod or whatever, and they're just chilling. And I'm like, you hear that and you don't think, and that's how you, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't
Right.
understand that.
You're not doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
You're bad at your job.
Yeah.
So by the time this made it to trial, of course, there was so much evidence that the defense team didn't even try to plead innocence. Instead, they just tried to mitigate the sentence and say that it wasn't premeditated, which,
I
all
get.
right, okay, I get that. That's fine. And the fact that, unfortunately, that she had staged the scene sort of kind of defeated this claim for the jurors, apparently. And as the autopsy showed, the most vicious blows were aimed at her, Jana's head, unfortunately. So, in January of 2012, January 27th, Brittany was sentenced to life in prison,
Wow.
where it is probably better that she stays,
Yeah.
respectfully.
Yeah. So like I was saying, I chose these cases because, or I chose this case to go in the set
Mm-hmm.
because the motives of the three definitely seem similar, that they're trying to, like you said, trying to prevent the truth of something from coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And the details of the crimes are so brutal to me. Just horrific. Like the weapons they chose to use, the how they went about it. I see a similarity there too, which I don't know if indicates like rage or that it was really spontaneous in the moment. Um, and it also seems like their families are either somewhat in denial about what their adult children are capable of. Brittany's dad, I guess, tried to plead for her to receive a lighter sentence, like, saying that she is a good person. And I think, like you said, it's really hard as a parent, to think of your kids in like a black and white way.
Mm-hmm.
And like we said, Brittany had that history of theft. And she too, I read that she too had lost an academic scholarship after being caught stealing from a classmate, um, which really makes me think of like that's something the three of them also have in common, right?
Yeah.
And Chris Porco seemed to have sticky fingers. He was always stealing things. So it's like the two, Brittany and Chris, have that in common. And and they all kind of, or at least Sydney more so, concocted the story about a break-in, another person being responsible, is also really similar to Brittany. So it's just the idea that, what what was their motive seems so small. I mean, I guess as an adult, even thinking back to my 20s, it just seemed like these were really minor things that are
Mm-hmm.
totally, you can cope with, you can get through them, kind of like Stephen tried to tell Sydney, like, this is part of growing up, you can get through this. Like, shoplifting a pair of leggings doesn't need to end someone's life, but
Like,
it's like
truly
there's some,
probably won't see jail time for it. Like, you're
yeah,
gonna pay a fine.
like you're going to lose your job. Yeah, for
For
sure.
sure.
But these, and I think that's what's really startling about them when you look at them as a whole. It's just these little mistakes that people make all the time, or these little stumbling blocks that, young adults have, just turning into these awful tragedies.
Mm-hmm. I
And
agree.
the thing that sticks out to me is the craziness of the stories that I'm going to just say that Chris and Brittany spun. I'm going to put Sydney in a separate category where it seems like there's the mental health issue, so we'll put that one aside. But the craziness of the stories that were spun, but really even they had to know on some level that they were going to fall apart with just even the most cursory analysis. This house of
Mhm.
cards was just going to
Yeah.
Yeah.
fall over quickly.
I agree.
I'm so paranoid. I'm not going to make a U-turn in a school zone. I think I'm going to get stopped inside it. They just put up a no
I
U-turn
know.
sign at our kids' school. We used
You're
to make a
better than
U-turn
me.
there. We don't. I'm not making a
Mm-mm.
damn U-turn.
I'm all
A guy
like,
took a U-turn today, and I
mail
like
me a
honked at him, and
ticket.
I was like,
Yeah,
bro, you
right.
can't do that.
Right.
Oh my gosh. Well, look at you. Yeah. No, I'm a Texas driver. So yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say about that. It is what it is. But I totally get it. And definitely in line with everything you guys are saying as it relates to those three cases. And like I said, unfortunately, these types of cases with these motives, whether it's, parent to child or vice versa, or even in Brittany's case, like this was not somebody she was related to. She really had no stake in the game in that sense, right? Like you could have easily just
Mhm.
walked away, but there was too much going on. Like, I mean, it's all just really confounding to me that these little minor things, like you said, are just mountains for them, and they feel insurmountable to them, so much so that they're willing to do these really permanent things for a very
Yeah.
temporary, problem, which is, again, just strange to me. I wish more than anything I could have a frank conversation with him where it wasn't gonna, penalize them in any of their appeals, but to just know, I could give them, truth serum and be like, "All right, let's talk about this. What's the
Yeah.
thought process here?"
Yeah.
I so wish I could do that. Um, because I truly do. I just wanna know why. That's what got me into true crime, is wanting to ask the why behind things and discover the why
Mm-hmm.
behind things, and, what I found in the time that I've been doing this is that you really don't get any unless they're being
Yeah.
forthcoming, and even then, um, most of the time, when you see, the killer speaks and stuff like that, these are people who are likely diagnosed as, narcissist in some way, have
Mm-hmm.
some signs of sociopathy and everything, even though, psychopathy and sociopathy aren't used anymore, but you get the idea. Um, are, are used to lying. So even then, they're not being truthful. I don't think they're
Mm-hmm.
capable of being truthful. I think one of the most chilling things I've ever seen, that I've watched several times just to kind of go, um, this is how evil is watching BTK's elocution
Uh-huh.
on his crimes and what he did, and just how blank and unmoved he was. He was asking, being asked his coffee order, "I take my coffee with some cream and sugar." That's how easy it was for him to go through all of these things. If you've never seen that, I highly recommend watching it, only because you can truly see, there's no emotion here. So when I see things like Killer Speaks and it's somebody who's committed, incredibly atrocious crimes, I'm like, and then they're crying and they're, expressing remorse. I don't believe it,
Mm.
because I've seen somebody who's done the most terrible of things and his victims were widespread, have absolutely no emotion whatsoever. And again, the mental health side of it, in terms of the disorders or personality disorders, obviously vary, but to me, it's really just kind of strange to see, and that's kind of what I've been chasing this whole time, is the why, and I know that I'll never get it. I'm the dog. I wouldn't know what to do if I catch the car, you know?
Yeah.
Um, but anywho, I definitely wanna thank you guys for joining me today. Sorry we went over, but as
Oh
a
no, it's
listener, you're
awesome. Thank
probably
you.
very happy about this, that, you get a almost 2-hour episode out of us.
Wow.
I really enjoyed having you both on to discuss these cases. And I love doing this show in particular because I can talk about cases the way I can't, the way I want to. And what I don't do on my show with True Crime Cases with Lanie is I don't ever offer any of my opinion. I don't give any, um,
Yeah.
things in there
Yep.
that I tell you the case and that's it. I let you come up with your own opinion. I think the only time you ever see me kind of emote, most recently, obviously, is with the Oakley case,
Mm.
because that was really personal to me, and I struggled with it so greatly. But I love doing this show in particular because I get to talk it out with other people and learn from others and how they think too. So, to me, these nuances are super important to talk about and gain some perspective on the cases, why we selected them, our own thoughts about them, so people, kind of see what went into making the episode. So, without further ado, just let us know where the audience can find you. And of course, as you guys know, I will always put the links in the show notes.
You're awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we had a good time, like kind of like you said. I mean, these cases are very not at all likely to be cases that we would cover on Sins and Survivors, because we're very regional focused on Las Vegas and maybe some of the surrounding rural communities,
Hmm.
and domestic violence cases in particular. So we even though we John and I talked about these cases, we never would have had this, the opportunity to share our thoughts with everyone. So we appreciate this as
Absolutely.
well. Sins and Survivors is on all the podcast platforms. Our website is sinsandsurvivors.com, and you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook at Sins and Survivors. We have new episodes that come out every Tuesday.
Yep. Yesterday's episode was part two. Part two. Our first time we've done a two-parter.
Mm.
The story of Camille Dardanes Dotson. She went missing in Las Vegas in 1994, and everyone needs to go listen to part one first, and then to part two.
Yeah.
Just dropped today. In a couple weeks, we're going to be talking about a very, very related case of Camille's first abusive
Mm.
husband, whose name is Gary Dotson, who was the first person ever to be exonerated by DNA evidence. Normally, not something we would cover, but
Yeah.
we were
It's
like,
really compelling.
it's
Yeah,
really
I was
interesting.
like, Gary is an abuser, but his story is something that all true crime fans could really get into with the DNA exoneration. I believe it was 1989.
Oh,
So
wow. Yeah.
before OJ, so it's really an interesting, compelling story. So we're looking forward to sharing that with everyone.
Oh,
It was the
awesome.
first
Yeah.
goat rodeo of a case.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
and
true too.
weekly too. So kudos to you guys. I could never do it. I tried once and I was like, no thanks. Well, thank you both for joining me. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you. This
Thank
was
you all
awesome.
for joining us live. If you were watching us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and on Twitter, because I refuse to call it X. So on Twitter and all that fun stuff. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the people in the comments. I didn't highlight any of them today, but thank you for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, that does it for tonight. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.